Picture this, a fairy tale romance, right?
Yeah.
But set against the glitz and glam of Hollywood.
Yeah.
A young woman chasing her dreams. Life seems perfect, but
Yeah.
then
Uh-oh.
it takes a dark turn.
It always does.
And that's what we're diving into today. The story of Jana Casian and Blake Leibel.
Right.
And, you want to learn more about this case. And we've got this Investor article, Tragic Dreams and Secrets, to help us out.
Yeah, the story of Jana Casian and Blake Leibel.
That's it.
It's a case that really, makes you think. Even in the City of Angels, there are still dark corners.
Exactly. So let's start with Jana, a Ukrainian tax lawyer, late 20s, decides to leave everything behind and come to L.A.
Wow, big change.
Yeah, new life, the energy of the city, all that. Anything else we know about what drew her here, besides, the classic American dream?
Well, the article talks about how optimistic she was, really believed in a fresh start, happy life. She even talked about starting a family, which makes this whole thing even more tragic.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. Okay, now on to Blake. Son of a wealthy Canadian developer, comes to Hollywood to chase a different kind of dream, right? Film, graphic novels, all that creative stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds pretty privileged.
It was, to a point. Both sides of his family had money, but the article hints at a bit of a complicated childhood. His parents were separated. Makes you wonder if that, had any impact on him, how he saw relationships, stability.
That's a good point. We can get caught up in appearances, but family stuff can have a lasting effect. And speaking of family, Blake's brother, Cody, lived a life that, well, it sounds like something out of a movie. Ferraris, high-stakes poker, even had ties to that underground world, like in Molly's Game.
Yeah, it's almost like he was living a double life. Glamorous on the surface, but
There were shadows.
definitely.
And Blake seemed to pick up on those, right?
Right. The article mentions that he started to get really worried about Cody's gambling debts. He was afraid that it would drag the family into something dangerous.
So we've got Jana, full of hope, ready for a new life. And then there's Blake, dealing with family issues and this growing paranoia.
And that paranoia is important here. It wasn't just a passing worry. It seems like this fear really took over his life. It affected how he saw things, what he did.
Do we know how that manifested? Like, did he act differently?
Yeah.
Did he talk about it? Those details could really tell us something about his mindset.
Absolutely. The article really focuses on the outcome, the tragedy, but understanding how that paranoia played out, that could be the key to understanding everything.
Okay, so in the middle of all this, Blake and Jana's paths cross.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Their lives were so different, but they ended up together.
The article says it was a whirlwind romance. Jana falling head over heels, wanting to start a family.
It makes what happened even harder to grasp, She had all these plans, all this hope.
And initially, her mother, Olga, was thrilled for her. Blake seemed to have it all right. But as things progressed, Olga started to feel like something wasn't right. It's that mother's intuition.
That gut feeling. It's amazing how often it turns out to be right. And in this case, it was. Tragically.
Yeah. So, driven by that feeling, Olga did something that would change everything. She called the police, asked them to check on Jana at her apartment. And what they found, well, that's where things take a truly devastating turn.
Yeah, the details are rough. Even for people who deal with the dark side of humanity all the time, what they found at that apartment, it was horrific.
And that scene is where we'll pick up next time. We'll look at how this tragedy unfolded, try to figure out what led Blake to such a dark place.
Yeah, we'll dive deeper into his past, his relationship with Cody, and try to understand how paranoia might have twisted his reality.
But before we do that, let's take a closer look at the investigation. The scene was gruesome, but how did they start piecing together what happened? What evidence did they find? What did it tell them? We'll explore that right after the break.
You know that Investor article? It really drives home just how brutal the crime scene was. Even seasoned investigators, people who see this kind of stuff all the time, it messed them up.
Yeah, when you hear about that level of violence, it makes you wonder what could push someone to that point. I mean, we've talked about Blake's paranoia, but were there any other signs of that kind of darkness?
Well, the article doesn't give us a complete psychological profile of Blake or anything, but there are these little hints about his personality, his creative work. They mention he was working on this graphic novel, and it had some pretty dark themes, lots of violence, a disturbing story.
Wait, are we saying his art was imitating life? Or the other way around? That seems like a stretch.
No, it's not about saying there's a direct link between his art and what he did. It's more about, thinking about how his art might reflect his inner world, his thoughts, his anxieties. Could the graphic novel be like a premonition, a way for those darker impulses to come out?
That's an interesting way to look at it. It reminds us that art often comes from a really personal place. But let's get back to the investigation for a minute. Did the police find anything at the crime scene that could tell us more about Blake's motive?
The article doesn't go into a ton of detail about the forensic evidence, but they do say there were no signs of forced entry. So it seems likely that Jana knew her attacker, and there weren't any defensive wounds either, which makes you think she was taken by surprise, couldn't fight back.
No signs of a struggle. That just makes this whole thing even more confusing.
Exactly. And even though the article doesn't say it outright, the fact that there wasn't a struggle could mean this was premeditated. It's scary to think about, but he might have planned this.
This wasn't some heat of the moment thing. This was calculated. And that makes understanding the why even more important.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to Blake's paranoia, his obsession with Cody, and his dangerous life. Is it possible that paranoia somehow spread to Jana? Did he start to see her as a threat, maybe even connected to his brother's world?
That's a disturbing thought, but it does seem to fit with what we know so far.
And to really understand what was going on, we need to look closer at Blake and Cody's relationship. The article mentions wealth and privilege, but was there something more there? Sibling rivalry, competition, resentment.
The article doesn't really address that directly, but it's definitely something to think about. Their lives seem like total opposites. Blake was drawn to art and creativity, while Cody was all about high-stakes living, that fast-paced and potentially dangerous world.
That contrast is pretty stark. It's like they were two sides of the same coin. And that makes you wonder, how did Blake see Cody's success? Or what he might have thought of as success? Did he feel inadequate, like he was living in his brother's shadow?
That's a great point. We usually think of paranoia as this outward fear, but could it also be an internal struggle, a battle with your own insecurities? Maybe Blake's paranoia wasn't so much about threats from the outside, but more about his own perceived failures.
That's a theory worth exploring. Maybe he felt threatened by Cody's charisma, his ability to navigate a world that Blake found both fascinating and terrifying.
So we have all these potential factors, right? His difficult childhood, his art, his growing paranoia, and the whole dynamic with his brother. It's a lot to unpack. How did the investigators even approach this case? Did they just focus on the physical evidence, or did they try to get into Blake's head?
The article mentions the trial, how it became a media circus, but it doesn't give specifics about the prosecution or the defense. Kind of frustrating because those details could really help us understand how the legal system tried to make sense of this.
It's like we're missing a key piece of the puzzle. We know what happened in the end. Blake was convicted, got life without parole. But how did the prosecution build their case? Did they focus on his paranoia, or were there other things that came out during the trial?
Makes you think. Maybe they presented evidence of his mental state getting worse. They could have used his graphic novel, things he said, even testimony from people who knew him, to show he was consumed by these fears and delusions.
Or maybe the defense argued that he wasn't in control of his actions, that his paranoia had taken over to the point where it clouded his judgment, led to this tragic but unintentional act of violence.
It's interesting to consider both sides and how they might have influenced how the jury saw Blake.
It shows that even when the outcome seems clear, the legal process can be a battle of stories, a search for the truth. Not just what happened, but why. And in a case like this, where the why is all tangled up with human psychology, that search can be a long and difficult one.
Definitely. And as we keep going with our deep dive, we're going to explore the bigger picture of this case, the connection between mental health, creativity, and the allure and dangers of ambition. We'll also look at how this tragedy affected those left behind, especially Jana's mother, Olga. She's been fighting for justice for her daughter.
And we'll think about the bigger questions this case raises, about the nature of evil, the darkness that can hide in seemingly ordinary lives, and how important it is to recognize the signs of trouble in those around us. It really makes you think, darkness can hide anywhere, even behind wealth and success. We've been digging into this case, looking at Blake's life, his art, that unsettling paranoia.
Yeah, and we've talked about the impact this tragedy had, especially on Jana's mother, Olga.
The article mentions how she just never gave up on getting justice for Jana. A mother's love, refusing to be silenced by something so horrible. It's really inspiring in a way.
It is. It shows how powerful a mother's love can be. Even in the face of grief like that, there's strength, resilience, a dedication to honoring her daughter's memory.
Her story, happening alongside this awful crime, it adds another dimension to this whole thing. It's not just about solving a mystery, it's about the human cost, the lives that were changed forever.
Exactly. We can get caught up in the details trying to figure out the psychology of it all, but we can't forget this isn't just a case file. It's about Real people, dreams that were shattered, the lasting effects of trauma.
And that brings up another point, the lasting impact. This case makes you think about how we see mental health, especially when it's connected to wealth and privilege.
Right, because people often think that if you have money, you're somehow protected from mental health problems. This case proves that's not true. Even in the most privileged circles, things can go wrong. Mental health issues can be ignored, left untreated.
The article doesn't really go into Blake's mental health history, but it does make you wonder if there were warning signs, chances to help him. If his paranoia was that deep, did anyone see it? Did anyone try to do something?
It's a good question. And it shows how important it is to talk about mental health openly, to encourage people to get help. Seeking help isn't weakness, it's strength.
That's a powerful message, especially in a world where we often think success means you're invincible. This case shows us that we're all vulnerable, no matter who we are or what we have.
And it highlights the importance of recognizing those signs of distress, not just in ourselves, but in the people around us. Maybe if someone had seen how bad Blake's paranoia was, if someone had intervened, this could have been prevented.
It's a hard thought to swallow. It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to be kind, to support each other.
Mm.
We may never fully understand what drove Blake to do what he did, but we can learn from it. We can be more aware of other people's struggles, push for a world where mental health is a priority.
That's a really important takeaway. This deep dive into Jana Casian and Blake Leibel's story has taken us through a lot. Horror, sadness, a sense of loss. But we've also learned a lot about what it means to be human, the complexities of mental health, and the power of empathy and awareness.
And as we wrap up, we want to leave you with one last thought. It goes to the heart of this case. How can we, as individuals and as a society, get better at seeing and addressing those hidden struggles that can lead to such terrible outcomes? Because sometimes the worst tragedies aren't the ones we see coming, but the ones that happen in the shadows, hidden until it's too late.